All right, so today we're going to talk about Muslim ethics. So we're going to talk about the law code within Islam, or law codes, as well as some of the issues within Muslim ethics that are brought up a lot in the media, in our culture, as well as some principal ethical values within Islam. So we're going to go over kind of a range of issues within this slide. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is something called Sharia law. And probably those of you who hadn't learned that much about Islam before this class, this is probably something that you had already heard of, because it is something that's brought up a lot within the media. So it's important to know, or to remember, right, that Islam is both a theology, it's a set of beliefs about God, and it's also a way to live one's life. So within Islam, the religious sphere and the social sphere are very much intertwined. And that goes back to the beginnings of Islam, because remember, Muhammad was not just the religious leader of the early Muslim community. He was also their social or political leader, because they set up a community within Medina. So Islam and the Quran contain teachings about what God is like, how to worship God, as well as how to live one's life and how to set up a community. So Sharia law is sort of inspired by that, right? That Islam is a total way in which to live one's life. So in one sense, we can say that Sharia law is very similar to the halakha, to the Jewish law code, the Torah law code, right? It's a set of laws or ethical codes that have teachings about every aspect of life. About how to worship God, how to treat other people, the foods that you should eat, the way you should behave in marriage, the way that you should treat your family, your spouse, your friends, your neighbors, your other members of society. So it really has teachings about every aspect of life, because Islam is an entire way of life. But it's important to know a couple things about Sharia law. Firstly, there isn't one Sharia law. So it's not like the halakha, in the sense that, remember, the Jewish law code, those 613 laws, they're all listed out in the Torah. So they're all right there. So really the emphasis in Judaism has been on how to interpret those laws. Every single law in the law code was given by God, but how do you interpret those laws and live out those laws in daily life? The Quran doesn't have that. So the Quran doesn't have, it's not like Sharia law is in the Quran, that it's, listed out a set of rules that everyone's supposed to live by. The Quran does, of course, have a lot of ethical teachings, but it doesn't talk about everything. There are lots of ethical issues that the Quran doesn't talk about. So Sharia law is based on a variety of sources. And because of that, there are different ideas about Sharia law. There are different versions of Sharia law out there. Prothero mentions that within the Sunni world, there are 4 main schools of Sharia law, but there are smaller ones, and then within Shia Islam, they have their own versions of Sharia law. So it's not just one entity, it's not just one thing. There are multiple versions of Sharia law that range from the very conservative to the more liberal. So as I said, it's based on a couple of different sources. The first one being, of course, the Quran. So if the Quran has a specific teaching about some sort of ethical issue, then of course the Sharia law code is going to be based on the Quran. What does the Quran teach about this? Because that's what God teaches about it. But as I mentioned, the Quran doesn't mention everything. So there has to be other places that Muslims look in order to find guidance for ethical issues. So the second source are the hadiths. So if it's not in the Quran, the Sharia law code will then look to the hadiths. And remember, that's the secondary body of literature in Islam. The hadiths are stories about the Prophet, things the Prophet did and things the Prophet said. But again, there are multiple hadiths, and different communities view different hadiths as authoritative. So that engenders some differences in terms of Sharia law. Then the third source, if there's, if there isn't something in the Quran about it, if there isn't something in the Hadiths about it, then it becomes the consensus of the Islamic community or scholars, right? Individuals within that community that are seen as respected, knowledgeable individuals about Islam. So depending on what community it is or what scholars it is, then that can also set up differences of interpretation in Sharia law. So there are several different versions of Sharia law out there that are, because they're based on these variety of sources, and different communities, societies, or countries have incorporated Sharia law to different extents. Right? Some Muslim countries do not have Sharia law incorporated into their legal system, and some have a lot of Sharia law incorporated into their legal system. But ultimately, it's supposed to apply only to Muslims, and it has teachings about every aspect of life. So now we're going to go over a couple of the issues within Sharia law that you may have heard of already. So the first one is that there are a series of dietary restrictions. So Muslims do have to follow certain rules in terms of what they eat and drink. And for some of them, they're very similar to Judaism. So Muslims are also not allowed to eat pork, so they can't eat any product that comes from a pig. And the meat that they do eat, also has to be prepared in a special way. The animal has to be killed with a minimum amount of pain, has to be killed in a humane way, and the blood has to be drained out. This preparation of meat is called halal, H-A-L-A-L. So when you go to the supermarket, if you're buying meat, a lot of times you'll see there'll be sort of like a stamp on it that will say if the meat is halal and or if the meat is kosher. And you can see actually there's a lot of overlap between halal meat and kosher meat. And then, as I mentioned, there's also restrictions in terms of drinking. So Muslims are not supposed to drink any alcohol. So those are some of the dietary restrictions that are part of the Sharia law. The next issue is something that is discussed in the Quran and is something that has become a very visible and sometimes controversial topic within our society, which is modesty in dress for Muslim men and women. So in general, in the Quran, it states that men and women both have to dress modestly. So they have to dress in a way, that shows humility and, is not too revealing or flaunting or showy, anything like that. And then there are some additional guidances for women, and I actually have you read, so in the World's Wisdom, you're going to read the section on modesty and dress, so you can see the actual Quranic passages that relate to the practice of women covering their hair, women veiling. In Arabic, the term is hijab. So women who do wear a veil over their hair, over their heads, as you can see in the picture behind me. These are Muslim women who are on a soccer team. So they're wearing a special veil, like a sports veil, for playing soccer. So as you probably know, not every Muslim woman veils, right? Not every Muslim woman wears a veil and covers her hair. And as you'll see, the passages in the Quran that refer to it says that wives of the Prophet and wives of true believers should draw their veils close around them so that they are not harassed. So the idea was that in the lifetime of the Prophet, some of the women in the community were being harassed. They were being catcalled. So this revelation, this teaching had to do with women drawing their veils close around them so that men would know that they were Muslim, to know that they should respect them and not treat them in such a way. And there's really only very few passages, just that one passage that really talks about the veil. Different Muslim women interpret that passage differently because, as we just said, some Muslim women veil and some Muslim women don't veil. But it's important to know, I guess, sort of the historical context of the veil. First of all, it was already practiced before Islam. So it's not a practice that started with Islam or started with Muhammad. Actually, in pre-Islamic Arabia, both men and women traditionally wore a veil over their heads. And you can see this still today if you ever see like the Saudi princes on TV. You can see the traditional Saudi dress, which is very similar to other Arabian Peninsula countries, which is they wear like a long white, the men wear a long white robe, and they wear a head covering, right? They wear a long scarf over their head. Sometimes it's white, sometimes it's red and white checkered. And then traditional Arabian clothing for women is the long black dress and then a black head covering. So the traditional clothing already was just kind of like a long black robe, or sorry, a long robe, different colors for men and women, and a head covering. So the veil was already a part of cultural dress for both men and women before Islam. So that's why the passage says, you know, women, draw your veils close around you. It doesn't say wear a veil because it was just already done at the time. And the veils for men and women were they were very practical. This is a desert community, a very hot and sunny climate. So most people wore a head covering because it's protective. It protects your head from the sun. It helps to keep you cool. You can get it wet and then it cools you down for the day. And it also is just sort of practical in terms of, you know, sand getting into everything, and it keeps that off of you. So it's something that was already done at the time. And so, as I said, that some, you know, today, some Muslim women interpret this passage to mean that all Muslim women should wear a veil. And some Muslim women interpret this to mean that was the historical dress of the time. But today, I can live out this passage in terms of simply drawing my garments close around me. If I simply wear modest clothing, if I don't wear clothes that's too revealing, then I'm also you know, living out this teaching. I'm following this teaching. But ideally, it's important to, or I was also going to say, before I get into that, that there are no guidelines within the Quran about how exactly the veil should be worn, other than it should be drawn close around you. So you probably also know that there's lots of different versions of the veil. There are some countries where women wear the full burqa, right? They wear a full, you know, head covering from head to toe, where everything is covered. That's more cultural than it is religious. And then there are some countries where, like Iran or Egypt, where oftentimes women will just sort of drape a scarf over their hair, but their hair is still showing. And then there's, you know, everything in between. So there's lots of different versions of the hijab, ways to wear the hijab, because the Quran doesn't say exactly how it's supposed to be done. And then the other thing I was going to say is just to know that ideally it should be a woman's choice. It is supposed to be a woman's choice whether or not she decides to veil. Not every culture, family, or country follows that, but ideally that is what it's supposed to be, that a young woman decides on her own if she is going to veil, and then it is her choice to do that, if she feels that that is what the Quran is asking her to do. So that's just a little bit about kind of an issue that does get brought up a lot in our culture. So you can see the exact Quranic passages that have to do with that, know a little bit about the whole cultural, historical background, and the diversity of opinions about it within the Muslim community. Then the next issue is that of polygamy, which is also an issue that divides the Muslim world. This is something that gets brought up a lot in Western culture. But again, just sort of to know kind of the background of it and how different Muslims view this issue. So polygamy is the practice of one man marrying more than one woman. And this is something that is practiced by some Muslim men, definitely not all Muslim men. So the Prophet Muhammad did have multiple wives. He had about 12 different wives during his lifetime, but they were all kind of, all the rest of them except his first wife, all occurred in just the last few years of his life. His first wife was named Khadija. She was a little bit older than him. She was his boss, basically. And he remained monogamous with her for the entire 25 years of their marriage until she passed away. Then, in the last few years of his life, He did marry several other women. Many of them were widows or orphans, which were very vulnerable in tribal Arabian society. So, generally, the idea or the interpretation has been that he married several of them in order to protect them. Because if you didn't have a father or husband figure to protect you in tribal Arabian society, you were in a very vulnerable or a dangerous position as a woman. So it was important to have that protective figure in that society. So he married many women. However, in the Quran, there are specific teachings about polygamy. And again, these are assigned to you so you can see what the passages say. There are two main passages about polygamy in the Quran, and you'll see that from these two passages, some Muslims believe that polygamy is acceptable within Islam, and some Muslims believe that polygamy is not acceptable within Islam. So the first passage says that basically men, if they don't feel that they can be faithful to just one woman, then they can have multiple wives. They can have up to 4 wives, but they have to treat them equally, both emotionally and financially. So you have to, love them and treat them the same. You can't, be very kind and affectionate to one wife and then be neglectful of another wife. You have to treat them the same. And you have to provide for them the same financially. You have to, they have to be living in similar, accommodations, and they have to be provided for equally. So because this passage is in the Quran, there are many Muslims that believe that polygamy is perfectly acceptable. And several Muslim countries allow for the practice of polygamy. It's legal for a man to have more than one wife. In those countries, however, it is something that has to be done very carefully in a court system. So if a man wants to take on another wife, he's already married and he wants to marry another woman, he actually has to go to the courts with his first wife, because his wife has to agree to it. So she has to testify in court that she is okay. She will allow her husband to take on a second wife. Then you also have to prove in court that you can, that basically you have enough money to do this. You are stable and secure enough financially that you can take on another wife and provide for her in the same way that you have for your first wife. So there are a lot of rules and regulations about how it's done. However, not all Muslims agree that polygamy is acceptable, and not all Muslim countries allow for it to be done legally. Because there's a second passage in the Quran where Muhammad says, or the revelation is that that try as you may, it is impossible to treat more than one woman equally. It is impossible for anyone to do that. So because of that inclusion of the second passage, there are many Muslims that say, no, actually Muhammad was just pointing out, or the revelation was pointing out, that it's impossible to do that. You can only marry multiple wives if you can treat them all equally, but it's impossible to treat them equally. Therefore, you can't do it. So there are many Muslims that believe that polygamy is actually not an acceptable practice. And again, you're going to be able to read the actual Quranic passages dealing with that, so you can see how they are interpreted in different ways. So those are just some areas of Sharia law. There's lots of different areas of Sharia law, but those are a couple areas that you may have heard about or that end up getting talked about a lot in Western culture. The next issue is jihad, and Prothero goes into in detail about the term jihad within Islam. So it's important to know, right, that it doesn't mean holy war. It's usually how it's translated in the media, but it's actually the Arabic word for struggle. And in general, it's seen as the struggle to make oneself or make society follow the will of God, right, to follow the teachings of God. So within the Quran, there are discussion of 2 different forms of jihad. There's an inner jihad and there's an outer jihad. And actually, Muhammad says that the inner jihad is the greater, meaning the more difficult and more important jihad, and that the outer jihad is the lesser jihad. So the inner jihad is the struggle with oneself, or the interior struggle to live a life of submission to God. Remember that within Islam, belief in God is seen as almost obvious, that of course there is a God. The struggle is not the belief part. The struggle is conforming one's life to the will of God, right? To living in submission to God. And so that struggle is a jihad. That's what jihad is. So Muslims wage jihad every single day, right? Every day they struggle with, sometimes there are things that I want to do, but I know that's not what God wants me to do, right? I know that I should do something different. So all Muslims are practicing jihad every single day, this interior struggle on a daily basis to live the type of life that God wants you to. The outer struggle is the struggle to make one's society reflect God's teachings. So this can be interpreted in different ways. For many Muslims, this is seen as social justice, right? That the outer jihad means that I have a responsibility to make my society reflect God's will. So that should mean, equality and civil rights, and the poor being taken care of, the weak being taken care of. That's what the outer jihad is about, right? That I need to struggle in order to create a more just and equitable society, because that's the type of society that God wants. But the outer jihad, of course, is the form of jihad that is used or misused by extremists and radicals to justify violence, right? To justify violence towards others. It's not unheard of that outer jihad could be used in a violent manner, but it's only happened a few times throughout Islamic history, and it has to be approved by an authority figure, and it has to be something that follows the guidelines of war within Islam. So remember, we talked about this already, that violence or waging war is allowed in Islam as long as it follows certain guidelines, right? The main guidelines being that it can only be done in defense of oneself or the defense of the weakless. The weak. So it can never be like a first attack. Muslims can never be the aggressors. They can only defend themselves if they are attacked, or if someone who cannot defend themselves is attacked. The response can only be to the same degree to which they were attacked. And it can never involve non-combatants, so it can never involve women, children, or civilians. So it has been used, a few times throughout Muslim history. For example, the Crusades, right? When Christian Europe attacked the Middle East in order to recapture the city of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, that was considered jihad. The defense of those lands was considered a jihad because it was defending oneself or defending one's country when attacked. So jihad is a term that has been sort of hijacked or misused by extremists and radicals within Islam in order to justify violence in means that are absolutely not allowed by the Quran. So it's important to have that, that background and that context for the term. So that's jihad. And then the last thing that I was going to talk about were just some very important ethical principles and values that the Quran and Muhammad talk about repeatedly. So these are sort of the main teachings or emphases that you see over and over again within the Quran as well as the Hadiths. The first one is honesty or fairness. Muhammad was oftentimes praised for being a very honest, fair, and straightforward individual, right? That he treated people equitably, that he never lied, and he was fair in all of his dealings with people. So honesty and fairness in everything that you do is very important for Muslims. Also, protection of the weak. A lot of this comes from, again, the tribal context in which Islam came about. Within a tribal society, the idea is that you have to have like an alliance, you have to have a network in order to be protected, because it was a society in which there was a lot of intertribal warfare. So For Muhammad and the revelations from God, it was oftentimes emphasized that you had to take care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, everyone who was in a weak or vulnerable position within society. So within Islam, it's very important to protect and take care of those who are less fortunate or are weak in society. And then also connected to what I was just saying, the rejection of tribal values. This idea that you only owe allegiance to your own tribe, to your own people, and then people outside of that, you don't have a responsibility to take care of them. So within the Quran and the Hadith, there's sort of a constant emphasis that you need to think of everyone as members of your tribe. That's why in Islam there's a lot of emphasis on the ummah, the community, the entire worldwide community of Muslims. That this circle needs to be expanded. This circle of who I have to protect, who I am responsible for, has to become ever and ever wider, right? Not just the idea that it's only my tribe that I have to protect and care for. And then no unjust taking of life. So again, that the defense is allowed within Islam, but you can never take a life unjustly. You can never break these rules about using aggression within Islam, that it is only supposed to be done for self-defense or defense of the weak, those in society who cannot protect themselves. So these are just sort of the values that get repeated a lot within the Quran and the Hadith, the teachings of Muhammad. Okay, so that was kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different issues, things that are very important within the Quran, as well as some of the issues that get talked about a lot within Western culture and Western media. Okay, so the last slide we have to do is just society, and then we'll be all done.